When I was working on a book on internet governance, one of the questions I asked myself is, well, what kind of a subtitle am I going to have? And I decided as a subtitle for the book that it is The New Frontier of Global Institutions. And there's a reason for that. When we usually think about things having to do with information, historically we've looked at it at the nation-state level, because governments take care of the issue of governance and regulation and whatnot. The internet is one of those things, perhaps like climate change, where that doesn't actually work very well. The internet with its protocols are essentially uncontrollable in some respects. Governments can try to make sure that they control the internet, and they will fail. It's because the structure of the science, that is the packet switching, means that the information doesn't go down a single channel. It goes through multiple channels and assembles at the end. Very hard to control. Well, internet governance actually came up as an issue because of that. It really goes back to the late 1990s when the issue came up of, well, how are we going to allocate addresses? One of the elements of the internet is how you make sure that the messages go to the right place. Well, the answer is everyone has to have an address. In the telephone industry, that's very easy because the telephone company gives you a number and they have various kinds of switching things which allow you to connect to dial up the number and somebody will answer at the other end. The internet doesn't work exactly like that because the packets go through different directions, can go through different ways. So you have to have a unique address. And one of the issues was, well, who gives you that address? Now, to a certain extent, that's the core of what has to be regulated. How do you determine who gets the addresses? The issue really turned not so much on whether you got the addresses, because they were assigned by a nice man at the University of Southern California Computer Center who had taken on the responsibility early on of assigning people addresses. It really didn't depend on that. It depended on what we now call the domain names. Everybody has a domain name. In Syracuse, it's syr.edu. If you are Apple, it's apple.com. Those are ways of making sure that people can remember your address, even if they couldn't remember the long 9-digit number that actually, it's a binary number actually, which is given to your address. The problem had to do with intellectual property. Now, intellectual property is something that governments regulate. It's to make sure that somebody doesn't steal your patent, or if you're downloading music, shame on you, you're doing it by paying whoever owns the copyright the rights to download the music. And they had issues like that. So back in the 1990s, the issue was, okay, well, how are we going to regulate address spaces? And the solution was a very simple one. The U.S. government, which had been, to a certain extent, one of the founding funders of the internet, said, well, we'll find a mechanism which is not exactly international, but not exactly governmental either. We'll set up a not-for-profit corporation, which happens to be located in California. Most of these, California has fairly loose laws on not-for-profit corporations, which will take care of the addressing issue. It's called ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. And their job is basically to regulate how you get an address. And there are all kinds of interesting issues there. This worked for a while. The function that was done by the University of Southern California passed over to ICANN. ICANN set up a system of global registers, people who could basically have the right to assign domain names. At the national level, at the international level, they began to deal with issues like what kinds of top-level domain names should we have in the future. In the good old days, it was .com, .mil, .gov, .edu, .net, and .int. Now there are a lot more. This is all being done by this ICANN. The reason that it became an issue of internet governance was that when, at the international level, governments got interested in what is the role of information and ICT for development, the International Telecommunications Union decided to have a global summit called the World Summit on the Information Society. And this was supposed to be a kind of a development-oriented thing. How do we how do we close the digital divide and whatnot. But when they had their first meeting, the first issue that came up wasn't any of this. It was the internet and who's in charge of it. And the problem was that if you looked at ICANN, you would see that ICANN existed because it had a contract with the United States Department of Commerce. And to a lot of countries, particularly developing countries, this looked suspiciously as though the United States was running the internet, and this became a political problem. Now, here's the problem with the internet. The internet is essentially borderless. Nobody can really control it. But if you try to control it, you run the risk of destroying it. In other words, the reason that the internet functions so well is because it's universal, it's open, it's free. But, you know, the question is, do we want to regulate it? Who should regulate it? What right is there? Well, you began to have initially a conflict between those who said there should be no regulation whatsoever. Freedom of speech, freedom of expression, which, by the way, is a part of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. We should have that. Others said, no, no, there are things that people will use the internet for which are bad. Child pornography, for example, or trying to overthrow my government. Oh, that would be a bad thing. And so governments began to say, we have to regulate it. Now, the issue was, well, how are we going to do this? How do we solve this political issue? Now, here you got to make a quick step backward and say, well, when you're talking about the international level, what are you talking about? We aren't talking about government. Governments are sovereign. Governments can, for their citizens, pass laws, pass regulations, have policies that will control you. The international level, you don't have anything like this, and that's why we use the term governance. Now, governance came up because it's different from government. Governance, they come actually from the same Greek word, which really means steering. At the international level, it really is steering. You get governments to agree on what governments ought to be able to do. You express that in some kind of binding agreement, and then you count on governments to live up to their obligations. The entire international system is based on these various kinds of agreements, which some of us call regimes. There are regimes like human rights, there are regimes for trade. The one that started the big problem with the internet, there are with intellectual property, and there are organizations that deal with this. The problem with the internet is that nobody really, as an institution, was in charge of it. Initially, the International Telecommunications Union wanted to be in charge of it, but unfortunately, they are mostly concerned with telecommunications companies. And the computer companies and the registries did not want the ITU involved with that because they said this isn't an issue of the telecommunications industry. It goes beyond that. So negotiations took place in the context of the World Summit on the Information Society to define, well, what is it that we really want to do? How do we go about finding a way to regulate the internet without killing it? That's basically the issue. And there were all kinds of possible solutions, but the main solution was very simple. We will create something called the Internet Governance Forum, and we'll bring a group of people, stakeholders, not only governments, civil society, the private sector, academics, and they will discuss how do we regulate, what should we regulate, what are the issues. Well, they've been doing this now for 6 years. It's an odd kind of thing because it isn't really an international negotiation. Some governments say, all right, this doesn't go far enough. We have to negotiate a convention, a framework convention on internet governance. Others say, shouldn't be anything, just let the magic of the marketplace roll. The probable answer is we'll find something in between, and that's what I said, it's a new frontier. We don't know exactly what kind of an institution will come out of this, because what we have here is something that isn't quite an international organization, isn't a government, isn't the magic of the marketplace, it's something else. And we will see over the next few years how that develops. And believe me, you've got some interesting stakeholders at play.